Though the fantasy genre in its modern sense is less than 2 centuries old, its antecedents have a long and distinguished history. Elements of the supernatural and the fantastic were an element of literature from its beginning. The hallmarks that distinguish the modern genre from tales that merely contain fantastic elements of the logic of the fantasy workings, the acknowledged fictitious nature of the work, and the authorship of the elements, rather than the source in folklore, works in which the marvels were not necessarily believed, or only half believed, such as the European romances of chivalry and the tales of the Arabian Nights, slowly evolved into works that showed these traits. Such authors as George MacDonald created explicitly fantastic works. The publication of The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien created an enormous influence on the writing of the field, establishing the form of epic fantasy, and also did much to establish the genre of fantasy as commercially distinct and viable. Today fantasy continues as an expansive, multi-layered medium encompassing many subgenres of literature, from traditional high fantasy and sword and sorcery, to magical realism, fairy tale fantasy, horror-tinged dark fantasy, and more. Differences between fantasy and earlier fantastic works. Even the most fantastic myths, legends, and fairy tales differ from modern fantasy genre in 3 respects. Modern genre fantasy postulates a different reality, either a fantasy world separated from ours, or a hidden fantasy side of our own world. In addition, the rules, geography, history, etc. of this world tend to be defined, even if they are not described outright. Traditional fantastic tales take place in our world, are often in the past or in far-off, unknown places. It seldom describes the place at the time with any precision, often saying simply that it happened long ago and far away. Quote, the second difference is that the supernatural in fantasy is by design fictitious. In traditional tales, the degree to which the author considered the supernatural to be real can span the spectrum from legends taken as reality to myths understood as describing in understandable terms more complicated reality, to late, intentionally fictitious literary works. Finally, the fantastic worlds of modern fantasy are created by and author a group of authors, often using traditional elements, but usually in a novel arrangement and with an individual interpretation. Traditional tales with fantasy elements used familiar myths and folklore, and any differences from tradition were considered variations on a theme. The traditional tales were never intended to be separate from the local, supernatural folklore. Transitions between the traditional and modern modes of fantastic literature are evident in early Gothic novels, the ghost stories in vogue in the 19th century, and Romantic novels, all of which used extensively traditional fantastic motifs, but subjected them to authors' concepts. By one standard, no work created before the fantasy genre was defined can be considered to belong to it, no matter how many fantastic elements it includes. By another, the genre includes the whole range of fantastic literature, both the modern genre and its traditional antecedents. As many elements which were treated as true by earlier authors are wholly fictitious and fantastic for modern readers. But even by the more limited definition, a full examination of the history of the fantastic in literature is necessary to show the origins of the modern genre. Traditional works contain significant elements which modern fantasy authors have drawn upon extensively for inspiration in their own works. The history of French fantastique literature is covered in greater detail under fantastique. Development of fantasy. romances. With increases in learning in the medieval European era, literary fiction joined earlier myths and legends. Among the first genres to appear was romance. This genre embraced fantasy, and not only simply followed traditional myths and fables, but, in its final form, added new fantastical elements. Romance at first dealt with traditional themes, above all three thematic cycles of tales, assembled in imagination at a late date as the matter of Rome, the matter of France, and the matter of Britain. Although a number of non-cyclical romances also achieved a great deal of popularity, the romances themselves were fictional, but such tales as Valentine and Orson, Guillaume de Palerme, and Quest del Saint Graal were only the beginning of the fantasy genre, combining realism and fantasy. During the Renaissance, romance continued to be popular. The trend was to more fantastic fiction. The English La Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory was written in prose. This work dominates the Arthurian literature, often being regarded as the canonical form of the legend. Arthurian motifs have appeared steadily in literature from its publication, though the works have been a mix of fantasy and non-fantasy works. At the time, it and the Spanish Amadis de Gaula spawned many imitators, and the genre was popularly well received, producing such masterpieces of Renaissance poetry as Ludovico Ariosto's Orlando Furioso and Torquato Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata. Ariosto's tale, with its endlessly wandering characters, many marvels, and adventures, was a source text for many fantasies of adventure. With such works as Amadis of Gaul and Palmerin of England, the genre of fantasy was clearly inaugurated, as the marvels are deployed to amaze and surprise readers. One English romance is The Fairy Queen of Edmund Spenser. The poem is deeply allegorical and allusive. Leaving allegory aside, however, the action is that of a typical knightly romance, involving knightly duels, and combats against giants and sorcerers. That is probably the first work in which most of the characters are not men, but elves. There are mentioned also the wars between goblins and elves, which were destined to have a great future in fantastic fiction. The tale of Don Quixote deeply satirized the conventions of the romance, and helped bring about the end of this time of romance. Although assisted by other historical trends in fiction, nevertheless, large subgenres of the field of fantasy have sprung from the romance genre, either directly or through their imitation by latter fantasy writer William Morris. The Enlightenment literary fairy tales, such as were written by Charles Perrault and Madame d'Aulnoy, became very popular early in this era. Many of Perrault's tales became fairy tale staples, and influenced latter fantasy as such. Indeed, when Madame d'Aulnoy termed her works Comtesse de Fouquet, she invented the term that is now generally used for the genre, thus distinguishing such tales from those involving no marvels. This would influence later writers, who took up the folk fairy tales in the same manner. In the Romantic era, several fantasies aimed at an adult readership were also published in 18th-century France, including Voltaire's Comtesse Philosophique, The Princess of Babylon, and The White Bull, and Jacques Cazotte's Faustian novel The Devil in Love. This era, however, was notably hostile to fantasy. Writers of the new types of fiction such as Defoe, Richardson, and Fielding were realistic in style, and many early realistic works were critical of fantastical elements in fiction. Aside from a few tales of witchcraft and ghost stories, very little fantasy was written during this time. Even children's literature saw little fantasy. It aimed at edifying and deplored fairy fairy tales as lies. In one respect, this was an essential stage in the development of fantasy as a genre. The development of a realistic genre ensured that fantasy could be defined as a distinct type. In contrast, Romanticism, in reaction to Enlightenment's cult of reason, Romanticism highly prized the supernatural, tradition and imagination, together with the age in which they were supposed to rule, Middle Ages. These traits readily borrowed traditional elements of the fantastic. The Romantics invoked the medieval romance as justification for the works they wanted to produce. In distinction from the realistic pressure of the Enlightenment, these were not always fantastic, sometimes being merely unlikely to happen, but the justification was used even from fantasy. One of the first literary results of this fascination was Gothic novel, a literary genre that began in Britain with The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. It is the predecessor to both modern fantasy and modern horror fiction and, above all, has led to the common definition of Gothic as being connected to the dark and horrific. Prominent features of Gothic novels included terror, mystery, the supernatural, ghosts, haunted buildings, castles, trapdoors, doom, death, decay, madness, hereditary curses, and so on. The fantastic, dream-like atmosphere pervaded the genre at this point. Gothic tales permitted, but did not require, an element of the supernatural. Some stories appeared to contain such elements and then explained them away. The genre straddled the border between fantasy and non-fantasy, but many elements from it, particularly the houses of particular import, being ancient, owned by nobles, and often endowed with legends, were incorporated in modern fantasy. Of particular importance to the development of the genre was that the Gothic writers used novelistic techniques and love, such as Defoe was using, rather than the literary style of the Romance, and also began to use the landscape for purposes of expressing the characters' moods. On the other hand, the Gothic still held back the pure fantasy. In The Castle of Otranto, Walpole presented the work as a translation. The fictitious original author is therefore responsible for its fantastical elements, which Walpole distances himself from. One noted Gothic novel which also contains a large amount of fantasy elements is Vathek by William Thomas Beckford. The romantic interest in medievalism also resulted in a revival of interest in the literary fairy tale. The tradition began with Giovanni Francesco Straparala and Giambattista Basile and developed by the Charles Perrault in the French Précieuses, was taken up by the German Romantic movement. Friedrich de la Montfouquet created medieval set stories such as Undine and Sintram and his companions, which would later inspire British writers, such as MacDonald and Morris. E.T.A. Hoffmann's tales, such as The Golden Pot and The Nutcracker and The Mouse King, were notable additions to the canon of German fantasy. Ludwig Tieck's collection Fantasies contained several short fairy tales, including The Elves. In France, the main writers of Romantic-era fantasy were Charles Nodier, with Smara and Trilby, and Tessifal Gautier in stories such as Omphale, and one of Cleopatra's Knights, and the later novel Spirit. In Britain, Sarah Coleridge also wrote a fantasy novel, Phantasmin, described as the first fairy tale novel written in English.